Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming for a slightly different event this evening. Rather than a debate, we have people who agree largely on things, and hopefully in the audience, people who disagree, which will be great fun. For our panel this evening, we are joined by two leaders of the Renew Party and the Cambridge leader of OFOC, which is Our Future, Our Choice. So we have James Torrance, James Clark, and Tommy Gale. The way the panel will work is they'll each be given a minute or two to introduce themselves, and then I'm going to open up the conversation with a few questions of my own, and then I'd like to give you a chance to question exactly how these two types of political movement plan to rethink Brexit, stop Brexit, and then what actually they want to do beyond. So without further ado, we'll start with James, number one, on the end, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I might stand up if that's all right.
Yeah, of course you can.
Hi, everybody. My name's James Torrance, and I think probably, as we just touched on, the best place for me to start is what are we actually trying to achieve? Because a lot of people will say to us, come on, you're a new party, first past the post. It's never going to go anywhere. Brexit's been done, it's a settled issue, that's never going to change. All you're going to do is make a little bit of noise and then disappear into the ether, and that may well be true. But the reality is that unlike many of the politicians apparently in our political system today, my answer to the question of what I want to achieve is that I genuinely want to change this country. And that pretty much defines every decision we make about whether we form a party, what that party looks like, and what we do with that party when it comes to it, and how we think we can achieve what we're setting out to achieve. We're not really interested in winning seats for winning seats' sake. We're not interested in kind of having a small amount of influence. We're not interested in solving a couple of minor problems. We want to change this country because there are so many problems in this country that need fixing completely from the ground up. Whether it's the fact that probably over the last 35 or 40 years, the bottom end of the income spectrum hasn't benefited a jot from economic growth. Whether it's the fact that large portions of this country are riddled with poverty, whether it's the fact that if you're in particular parts of this country, you're likely to live for 10 fewer years than somebody in the richest part of this country. There are many, many problems that really need to be addressed and are being completely failed to even be looked at by the representatives of both major parties. On the one hand, on the left, you have Jeremy Corbyn and a world in which he's trying to get to a socialist wonderland. But I firmly believe that that will just impoverish us all. And on the right, you have a prime minister who thinks that people like me don't even understand what it means to be a citizen of this country, who, in a way, we don't even have the right to call ourselves citizens. We don't know what it means. And that I find deeply troubling, because that represents a nationalist tone of the debate, which is incredibly unhealthy. And time and again, in the debate we see, in the political discussion we see today, that's very, very damaging, because that message gets taken and it gets magnified and concentrated and directed into very, very harmful ways by individuals and other parties. And in the middle, we have a party which has failed to represent the voters it claims to represent. It's failed its core vote in the past, and the people who agree with them today are not really willing to listen to them anymore. And that is tragic. And so if you want to change this country, you have to change the parties who are governing. And that doesn't just mean you go in, you make some minor alterations to them. We need to change them wholesale. And in order to do that, we need to challenge them. And that's why we founded Renew, because the best way to challenge them is to compete with them directly, and that's why we're here today. We're at the beginning of the process, it's early days, we can't claim victory yet, but we're certainly going to try. So it's a joy to be here. I look forward to your questions later on.
Thank you, James. James, are you next, or Tommy?
I'll go next,
Introduce
sure.
yourself, yeah.
Hi, I'm Tommy, and I'm the Cambridge leader of Our Future, Our Choice. There's a few ways that you can shorten Our Future, Our Choice, or interpret Our Future, Our Choice. One on Urban Dictionary is overwhelming feelings of concern, which seems to do a pretty good job. The other is just the acronym OFOC, or what we like to usually do is just oh fuck. although maybe more accurately OFOC might work more nicely. And I think that encapsulates quite well the two things that we're trying to bring together. And it's basically anger on the one hand and optimism on the other. On the one hand, there's the anger that we're not being listened to and we feel like Brexit doesn't represent us as young people. And on the other hand, there's the idea that we can actually do something to change this. And I think there's three reasons why Our Future, Our Choice, or OFUC, is the reason and the way that we can do that. The first is to do with democracy, and it's really more on the side of anger. And that is the idea that it doesn't represent us. Now, 75% of young people, 16 to 24, or 18 to 24, voted to remain in the European Union. And I actually agree with what David Davis said, which is quite a shocking admission, which is that if a democracy cannot change its mind, it ceases to be a democracy. And I think that's really important, because if a democracy is to work, it has to adapt to the people in the country at a specific time. And if they've changed their mind, or if the demographic of that country is changing, which it is in this country, in fact, by the time we're due to leave, we will be a Remain country demographically, based on the number of people who would have died, it's pretty morbid, and the number of people who will have come of age to vote. There's no statistical doubt, really, that we'll be a Remain country by the time we leave. And so, really, there's an anger that we're not being represented, and that Brexit doesn't represent us, which lies at the heart of what we're doing. The second thing is that we aren't being listened to by the people who said that they were going to listen to us, and actually represent us on the national stage to go against this thing that doesn't represent us in any way. And by that, I'm specifically referring to the Labour Party, who have had such a ridiculously unclear approach to Brexit that a staggering proportion of the country, and more worryingly its own MPs, don't seem to know what their approach is. In fact, I wrote down a few disagreements that I could think of within the Labour Party. On the second referendum, Deanne Abbott, she came out in favour of one, and then Jeremy Corbyn has disagreed. In paying for EU markets, Keir Starmer came out in favour of paying, Tom Watson then disagreed. On the single market, John McDonnell came out in favour, and then Keir Starmer and Jeremy Corbyn both went against that. So they can't even decide among themselves. So it's no wonder that the Labour Party, who really are in the best position to stop Brexit, are doing such a poor job. And their excuse up until now has been that, well, if we came out in support of Brexit, we'd isolate the people in our party who want to leave or the people in the country who want to leave. But recent polling by YouGov, which was actually done in conjunction with OFOC, shows that Labour would actually double their youth support if they came out in favour of Brexit. So it's not even electorally ridiculous for them to consider doing what we're asking them to do, which is to come out more in support of Brexit and even to support a second referendum. And so really that point starts with a bit of anger that they're not representing us at the moment, but really it also ends on a bit of optimism in that we are the largest demographic of Jeremy Corbyn. We are the largest demographic, of Jeremy Corbyn's electorate, and so we really do have the power to actually pressure him to change Labour position. So the first one is democracy, the second one is the fact we're not being listened to, but we could be listened to. And the third idea is that OFOC is the answer to this. And I think that's for two reasons. The first is that we genuinely have a groundswell of support. So in the first week since we formed, we've got 12,500 followers on Twitter from nothing. We're in over 50 universities already, and we've been doubling our rate of membership every single day. So there's clearly a huge amount of support and anger and desire to actually change something, which is being manifested in how well we're doing on the ground already. And we're not just trying to go into the universities, but we're trying to represent all of young people, whether they're doing apprenticeships, whether they're not at uni, whether they are at uni, whether they're at secondary school or university, because often people at secondary school are overlooked because they're not young enough, because they're not old enough to vote now, but they could be old enough to vote in 2 years. So there's a whole range of young people who we could bring on board and we are bringing on board. But what makes it so hopeful is that we also have the representation at the top. Andrew Adonis has merged his campaign with us already. And lots of Labour MPs are very interested in what we're doing. We've met with them and they've expressed great support. So we've got this both bottom-up swell of support, and we've also got a sort of top-down level of power that we can actually use to pragmatically make some difference. And so really, I just want to end by calling you to get involved if this is what you really believe in, which is that Brexit is a disaster for young people and that it doesn't represent us. And you can do that by coming along to our Cambridge meetings, where we're going to be discussing exactly the methods by which we can pressure the Labour government most effectively to achieve these aims. And also by liking us on social media and following us on Twitter, so you can really be part of this movement. And at the moment it's about growing this movement in size so that we've got the legitimacy to actually make the impact that we want to make. And it's really about growing it to become a movement that can actually take back our control of the Brexit process instead of giving it away to the people who voted on our behalf. So I think really it's quite an exciting movement in that we've got this groundswell of support, we can actually do something with it, and I think we could achieve something pretty historic. So thank you.
Thank you, Tommy and James.
Hello, my name's James Clark and I'm Head of Outreach at Renew. I stood as an independent candidate in Bermondsey and Old Southwark at the last election on a pro-EU platform. During the campaign, I met James here and other candidates. James was in Kensington, Chris Coghlan, who stood in Battersea, and Tim Lord, who stood in Westminster, all on independent pro-European platforms. Following the election, we got together to see if there was a way of forming into a broader grouping, and this is how Renew was born. As head of outreach, I speak to anti-Brexit groups, supporters, volunteers, donors, and most importantly, candidates. We've now recruited over 250 candidates and are well on our way to get 650 by the end of spring. There are three main themes of the conversations I have with people who are interested in joining Renew. The first is disenchantment with the traditional parties for being complicit, all in their own way, in our current political shambles. Secondly, I hear dismay at the conduct of the referendum, the outcome of the referendum, the state of the Brexit talks, and also a broader degeneration in public discourse and the difficulty that we have in having a sensible conversation about Brexit. One of our candidates described it quite memorably as the worst knock-knock joke ever. Knock, knock, who's there? Brexit? Brexit who? What? Brexit who? Will of the people. Brexit who? Shut up, you lost, etc. Quite depressing. The third thing I hear is a desire to stand up and do something before it's too late. So I speak to ex-Labour voters who feel that their party has been hijacked by the hard left. They're bewildered by the fact that Mr. Corbyn, either through leftist conviction or political expediency, is refusing to represent the majority of Labour voters or MPs' opinions on the topic of Europe. I speak to ex-Tories who vowed never to vote Conservative again, so mortified are they that their party is somehow making Mr. Corbyn look good. These people are appalled to see what they describe as the political cowardice against the moderate majority of Tories that's allowed an internal party issue, that is, the minority of unreconciled ideological Europhobes, to metastasize into a national crisis and then foist it upon the nation. And I speak to Lib Dems who have concluded that their party has finally become politically and electorally irrelevant. These people are disenchanted at the party's singular failure to corral the Remain vote in any meaningful way. We don't know why this is. The post-mortem on the Lib Dems is not yet complete, but we know why it wasn't. It wasn't because the public has reconciled themselves to Brexit, and it wasn't because the public fell in love with the far left or the far right. One of the questions I ask prospective candidates is, why do you want to get involved? And the answer is often very Brexit related, and I keep notes. So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to share some of the more memorable responses from a candidate in Kettering. The morning after the referendum was like one of those hangovers where you know you've done something awful because all your mates have gone quiet on you, but suddenly you have friend requests from Vladimir Putin, Rupert Murdoch, and Donald Trump. From a candidate in Kendal, it's like getting the worst of all possible worlds. No single market, no freedom of movement, and no new trade deals. And you can bet your life they'll keep us entering Eurovision just to give us a hiding every year. Null point for eternity. I just can't bear it. And from our candidate in Lewisham, whenever I'm in Europe now, I keep getting these pitying stares from everyone. It's like Groundhog Day, and I'm constantly reliving the day after England got knocked out by Iceland in the effing Euros. However, in these conversations, what's becoming clear is that the appetite for a new party that opposes Brexit with policies based on facts and evidence from the centre ground is colossal and growing, and that gives me hope. 2018 is going to be a big year. A lot can happen, and a lot of people want to be on the right side of history. When grandchildren ask, what did you do in the Brexit years? We think it's important to be able to say that you stood up and made it counted and made a difference. Since we've been going around the country listening to Britain, we've been getting quite a lot of press, and that has inevitably put us on the radar, not only of the trolls of the alt-right, but also their ogres, orcs, and goblins. When Breitbart described the emergence of Renew as globalization strikes back, thank you very much, and accusing us of being Macronite traitors in the pay of the French, the below-the-line comments were quite breathtaking. My favorites, the world's #1 globalist is probably behind this, if only, right? Question, what's the difference between a slice of toast and a Frenchman? You can make soldiers out of toast. Anna Soubry would be the perfect choice as candidate. She's so civil-eyed, her optician has to sedate her just to fit her glasses. Macron's appeal north of the Watford Gap would go down like a cup of cold sick. And my personal favorite, in all caps, time to boycott the Frogistan shithole. That's shithole spelled with just one H, swear fans. So we at Renew would like to be the vehicle for those who feel politically homeless, who feel let down, but also people who feel that enough is enough and want to get actively involved in fixing the UK's problems. The gulf between the ordinary voter and the increasingly careerist Westminster MPs needs to be bridged, and that's why we're recruiting people from outside politics, people who actually work in the industries and institutions that are suffering. Our people include NHS staff, teachers, lecturers, a few grad students, ex-military, former diplomats, small business owners, and ordinary people from all over the UK. To many of us, the referendum and its outcome is a symptom of a broader problem, that the parties of Westminster are no longer fit for purpose, and the tendency to polarization and extremism is not in the best interests of the UK. The electorate deserves better than this. Hence, Renew. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to each of you. I have one first question, which is before we get on to Brexit or the nature of political parties and the practicalities of starting a party. The actual act of referenda themselves, do you think there's a danger that, I know both of your groups call for a second referendum, is there a danger whereby the public starts relying too much on referendums to make decisions, that we end up moving away from representative democracy and towards a sort of strange quasi-direct democracy where in fact the people never know quite when their decisions are binding or not? We'll start with James at the end.
I don't think the danger is there, if only because it's quite so obvious when you talk to a lot of people, and Brenda from Bristol was an example of this, how tired they are of voting, which is a challenge for us. I don't think the British people have really got an appetite for making every decision for politicians. But what is definitely true is that certainly on this issue, people are convinced that this is something that gets decided by the people through a plebiscite. And I think if it was overturned through any form of, MPs vote exercising representative democracy, there would be riots in the streets. And I'm not entirely sure I could blame them.
Anyone else?
I don't think the public are fed up of experts, but I think we probably are going to be fed up of referenda. But let's have one last one on the final say, then stop altogether, shall we?
And I think it's important on the specific issue of Brexit that the kind of mode of democracy that was chosen was a referendum. It was put to us as a referendum. And so the only real effective way you can reply to that, assuming that none of the real main parties who have a chance of actually having a say are going to advocate a pro-EU position, the only way you can really realistically reply to that is through a referendum. So even if you don't agree with them as a general principle, I think on this specific issue, it's quite important, especially for young people, that they have a say on the final deal, so that it doesn't get left to parties that aren't currently representing their voice.
If you think that Brexit won't happen, what do you think the EU response would be to that, of us going in and then sort of nearly getting there and then backing out again? Do you think they'd be pleased? Do you think they thought we were wasting our time?
They'd be delighted.
Yeah.
Like throughout all of the negotiations, the whole Brexit process, the primary goal of the European Union has been to maintain the cohesion of the remaining states. So having a state like Britain go to the precipice, look over the edge and go, actually guys, it doesn't look much fun, don't bother, would be a very, very powerful message to maintain the cohesion when you've got a number of forces in the EU, whether it's Greece or Italy or Marine Le Pen in France, who have actually quite a Eurosceptic message. If you were the European Union right now, you'd love us to change our mind, and that would be welcomed by them.
Agree? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that what the EU have been saying all along is that really behind the surface of it, they would love us to come back, because all of the arguments that they were making before we left would still stand. You know, that they want us to be part of it because they don't want to encourage other separatist movements across Europe. You know, they want us to be part of a stronger union. And so none of those arguments don't exist anymore. They still stand. So I can't see any reason why they would want to change their position now.
Yeah, I think it would be a massive PR win for the EU if somehow we were able to remain. I also think it would make the EU slightly more malleable to arguments from the UK to work in our interests when we do argue for a special interest for the UK.
If we were to hold the Leave Remain referendum again today, do you think the result would be the same?
No. I strongly believe that everybody who didn't show up in 2016 would show up this time around. I asked this question of Lord Mandelson last year, and he said, I don't know the answer. I don't know why the CBI didn't show up. I don't know why the city didn't show up. I don't know why the major multinationals didn't show up. I don't know why prominent Remainers and millionaires didn't show up, but the fact is they didn't. I'm almost certain that in the event of a referendum on the final say, all of those groups would show up. You would have perhaps the best advertising campaign ever seen in the UK, and I think a comfortable Remain vote would result. I would be wary of looking at the polls. The other thing that we see when we look at the failure of polls is that people behave differently in the privacy of the booth than when they're called on their home phone at tea time. I think a lot of devout leavers would secretly vote Remain in a second referendum if they actually feel that their quality of life is going to be threatened.
And I think also it's only going to get more the case that we become more of a Remain country as we go on in time. So it might be quite close if we held it tomorrow, but I think the longer we leave it, in a sense, the more likely it is that we'd vote to Remain. Not only for demographic reasons, because people who weren't 18 at the last election will suddenly be able to actually vote, and if they vote the same way as their brothers and sisters, then it's very likely that they would vote to Remain. But also, I think if we were actually in the position of having a second referendum, it probably means that Labour would have had to come out in favour of a second referendum to actually get that through Parliament. And I think one of the main factors that caused us to lose the referendum was Jeremy Corbyn's lacklustre support. And I think if he had actually come out and was very positive about the European Union and really rallied that youth vote behind him that he definitely does have, then that would, again, be something that would really push us towards a Remain vote. And we don't have to make up that much. I mean, it was 52-48. So it's only a few percent that we'd need to make up. And based on regret of people who wanted to leave but now regret the decision, New Demography, and the Labour Party coming out in favour of it, I think you can make a pretty strong case that we'd do pretty bloody well.
Yeah. Do you think that maybe you talk about how more people would vote Remain tomorrow or the day after and each day going on, but is there not a case to say the opposite? And that in fact maybe people will feel like the more into the deal that we go and the more into the negotiations we go, the more time we would have wasted or the more expense we would have unnecessarily incurred, because we've now essentially kind of taken that route and gone down that path, and a lot of people might feel like, well, we've got this far, we may as well just do it. It's not as much of a disaster as I thought it was because it seems fine. You know, is there a case for that argument or not really, do you think?
I think what you get is a lot of people might say things like that. If you ask them, if you talk to them, they'll be like, oh, we've come this far, maybe we'll carry on. But you'll see an effect which is possibly the opposite of what we saw in 2016, which is people get into the booth and they go, what do I actually want to do? And I don't believe that there will be people going in going, I want to remain in the EU, but I feel we've come this far that I'm going to pass up the opportunity to reverse it. I think you'll get a lot of people going, yeah. Of course, we'll probably end up leaving, but I would prefer to stay. And it's where they put their cross in the box that I care about, not what they say on social media in the immediate run up to it. But there's also something that will happen as we get closer to March 2019, which is the kind of miasmic world of what Brexit might look like will start to condense and become very clear in that you will not be able to sustain the argument that we can both have fantastic trade deals and not in any way impact our trade with the EU, which is a claim that's been still made to this day by the Leave campaign, but which, when the deal is on the table, that will fall away. The ability to do that will fall away. And so you won't be able to unite the people who want to have fantastic trade deals and the people who want to retain their trade with the EU but just control immigration a bit more, for example. And so by dividing those, it becomes easier to win.
I think actually it paints a pretty dim view of people's mentality, that if they thought things are going pretty badly, they think, oh, well, let's just suck this in altogether. I think actually if you look at what people on all sides of the debate are feeling, no one's really happy with how the negotiations are going. I mean, the Conservatives aren't happy, Lib Dems aren't happy, Labour aren't happy. I mean, they're doing badly by anyone's standards. So I think the idea then that you would somehow support them to carry on doing really badly in order that we could get out is quite a strange idea. I think more likely is that people will realise that the people actually negotiating this deal for us are completely incapable, and that they'll actually think, Jesus Christ, what have we just voted for? I think we need to actually step back and think about this again, because we've basically just given power to people who don't know what they're doing to get us a crap deal. So I think actually quite the opposite.
Quite.
Looking at Renew as a political movement and a political party, I don't know whether you often get this sort of comparison with En Marche in France. If you look at En Marche, even 6 months before the election in France, most people hadn't heard of them. A lot of people certainly hadn't heard of Macron. Do you guys see yourself as future prime ministers? Do you think you have the capacity to do what they did? Or are you not the same movement at all? Is that not your aim?
I'd love to say it was my aim. You have those dark moments in the night where you're like, especially when you've had a good day on Twitter and it's all going well, and you go, this could be a thing. But the reality is we've got some immediate priorities. We think we can contribute to the debate around Brexit, and we think that we can be a very important piece of the puzzle around Brexit, which is that at the moment, MPs from neither major party are concerned about losing to an anti-Brexit candidate at the next election if Brexit goes through. And that's really dangerous, because that means that as successful as the anti-Brexit campaigning groups can be, there will never be an MP who's willing to take the risk necessarily, or you need a lot more support behind an anti-Brexit movement before you have an MP who's willing to take the risk to rebel against the party whip or to rebel against their membership. And the reality is we need at least kind of 7 or 8 Tory MPs to do that. But if you have a group in there who is going to compete with them at the next election, and even if it is, I'm just going to take 1% of the vote as I did in Kensington, which was enough to kick out a pro-Brexit MP, or 5 or 10% of the vote, which would be enough to kick out a lot of Tory MPs in a lot of seats, you then get those Tory MPs going, if I go with Brexit, I'm going to struggle in 2022. And if I vote against it straight off in Parliament, I'm going to get hit anyway. And when you catch them between the devil and the deep blue sea like that, that's when they go, I'm going to pass the buck back onto the British people. And that's our immediate aim. That's our strategy for the next 9 to 12 months, basically. Once we do that, ask me again.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, what Macron did was inspiring. That movement proved that an awful lot of change can happen in a short time. Of course, we in the UK knew that already. Can we be the new En Marche? Perhaps, perhaps not. I feel that we're overdue a transformational change in the UK. I don't believe that people are prepared to go on voting the way they used to vote along tribal lines. And I think all bets are off. I think all bets are off, and I wouldn't see the next election through the prism of the last elections, because we do appear to be entering a kind of a new era. So I'm optimistic.
Okay, and does that sort of image apply for Our Future, Our Choice, or I suppose you're more of a pressure group
I
than
mean,
a
yeah,
party?
I think the idea that we're the next Macron, the next En Marche is a bit much, maybe. But I think what we're trying to do is quite different, really. We're not standing in seats. We're not taking on parties across the board. We're specifically trying to go for one aim. And as UKIP showed, you can't build a party around one policy. So we wouldn't be thinking to do that. At the moment, it's basically about creating a movement of people that's big enough to give it legitimacy to have a say on the national stage. And I think that's actually just as powerful in a different way, because at the moment it's not being heard. And there's clearly that anger and that desire to do something. And so if we can actually put that pressure on the people at the top, that's our main aim. And I think we're doing pretty well with that so far. So yeah, different aims, but similarly optimistic.
No, that's great. I'm going to let the audience ask some questions for a bit, if that's all right with you. If anyone has a question you'd like to ask, please put your hand up. And I don't know if we have any microphones going around. Yeah, we do. Great. If you could get a microphone so that you can be well heard.
Thank you, Mr. President. Theo from Jesus. I actually have 3 questions and 2 points, so I'll leave it up to you to decide how many of those I ask or put to the panel.
I'll come back to you for the others, so start with the first one, and then we'll see how many questions there are.
Which one is... Okay. Last week, we were very lucky to have some distinguished politicians come and debate about Brexit. And one of those was Nicky Morgan, who I think we can all agree is pretty moderate on her views about the EU. She's an open Remainer, campaigned very hard in the referendum for the Remain position. And I was lucky to be able to have a conversation with her where I put to her the idea that if we reran the referendum and we had a similar result to what we experienced this time round, but the other way, so we had 52% voting Remain, 48% voting Leave, we will then have a situation where 48% of the British electorate, so nearly 17 million people, assuming that we get the same turnout as last time, don't just lose their faith in the political system. Well, they don't just lose faith in the political parties, but they also lose faith in democracy, because suddenly they voted in a referendum. It was very clear that whatever decision we made was the decision. You know, tens of millions of pounds were spent sending leaflets to every household in the UK saying this is what the vote means. And then they've had that position completely reversed. So I'm of the view that this country can survive Brexit. It may even do well, who knows. But what it can't survive is a fundamental undermining of our democracy of that ilk. So what do you say to that proposition?
It's such a bullshit suggestion, right? Like, it is based in the idea that democracy is defined by a decision we made on the 23rd of June 2016, and that we can undermine that by another democratic decision several years later. To invert the scenario that you're suggesting, what you're saying is that those 17 million people are so committed to democracy, they are so reliant on that 23rd of June 2016 decision, that possibly knowing in a scenario where they know that the majority of the people out there disagree with them, that a more recent vote would enrage them so much that they would abandon democracy altogether. It's nonsensical. It's the same as saying, it's like all the people who voted for New Labour in 1997 being suddenly dismayed that you have a Tory government in 2010. Democracy goes on. It's a constant process. And I find it, on the one hand, I understand Jacob Rees-Mogg was here last year. If I was Jacob Rees-Mogg and I was confident that the will of the people was for Brexit, I'd want a referendum every day. Because every time the people vote for Brexit, that is a nail in the coffin of the Remainer idea. That makes it life easier for Jacob Rees-Mogg every single time that decision is delivered. The reason he doesn't want another vote is because he fears he would lose. And if you fear you would lose, that's because you know that out there right now, and this is supported by the polling right now, the majority of people disagree with him. And if you're saying, well, we can't vote again because I would lose, then you're not such a democratic champion as you make out. And if I'm going to, exist in a world where we can't make democratic decisions because half the country would be pissed off, that's what every election is. And, I'll leave it to Tommy to describe how pissed off the majority of the country would be in that situation, where they would want to remain in the EU, but would be deprived of doing so permanently.
Tommy?
Yeah, no, I think that the youth element of this argument is really coming into its own on this specific issue. And I know I mentioned this near the beginning, but if you look at the number of people who will be able to vote by the time we leave, and the number of people who have died who voted leave, we will actually be a Remain country by the time we actually leave the European Union. And it seems to me quite a strange suggestion to say that it is undemocratic to do something that by the time we do it, no one or the majority doesn't agree with. And I think the whole point of democracy, as James said, is that it is continuous. And you can debate whether or not referenda in general are a good idea, because I've got my doubts about whether referenda in general are a good idea. But unfortunately, that's kind of been what we've given with this. David Cameron decided that he was going to make it a referendum, and that's what we've got to deal with. If it was in the form of a general election, we get our say every few years. We can say, if we disagree, we can vote a party out. If we agree, then we can keep them in. But with Brexit, given the current positions of the parties, we don't have that choice. And so I think, actually, if it's to be at all representative by the time we leave, bearing in mind that Brexit is an ongoing process that's going to take many years, if we suddenly said that, because it could take 10 years more, maybe, by the time we've done all of our trade agreements, if we suddenly were still basing that on a vote we did, years and years ago, by the time we finished, then I think that's quite weird. We're still being constrained by something that we had decided a while ago. So yeah, I think it has to be an ongoing process, and I think that's especially important, given that we'll only get more and more of this youth vote coming through, which is extremely pro-Main. So that argument's only going to get stronger.
Yeah, just to put some context into this 52-48 thing that we hear so often, 17.5 million people voted for a radical departure from the way we've been conducting politics and business in this country since before I was born. To my mathematics, that leaves 48 million people who didn't. And I think it's important to say that and to understand that when we talk about 48-52, will of the people, etc., etc.
Thank you. Any more questions at all? Yes. Behind, yeah, to your right, yeah.
Hi. So yesterday, just down the road, Sir Vince Cable was doing a talk at John's, and someone brought up to him the issue of parties such as yourself coming along with an anti-Brexit platform. And he said his issue with that was the atomization of the movement, so splitting the anti-Brexit vote. And for example, you said you stood in Kensington. I believe Labour won by something like 20 votes. So if a single other independent candidate had stood in Kensington, the Tories would have retained that seat. So what do you think of the idea that splitting the anti-Brexit vote could, in the first past-the-post context, be counterproductive?
Where did the vast majority of Remain votes go in 2017? They basically went to Labour, right? They went to a party that stood on a hard Brexit manifesto platform. I'm quite happy to split that vote, right? If Jeremy Corbyn right now is getting votes from Remainers that are not achieving anything in terms of keeping us in the EU, I'm happy to take votes off him. I'm happy to give him a reason to change his mind. Your suggestion that had there been another independent, I mean, there was another independent in Kensington, but if there'd been a third independent, it depends a lot on who they're appealing to. I pitched my appeal very much at frustrated Tory Remainers, and that helpfully is what justifies me in taking the credit for the massive 10,000 vote increase in the Labour vote, for which they deserve a huge amount of credit. But it was enough, possibly, to get Labour over the line. And Labour over the line on a better platform than the Tories. It was an imperfect result, but it was better than nothing. I'm happy to stand there, to stand on that basis. The big problem, you know, when Vince Cable stands up and says we're going to atomise the Remain vote, at the moment he's polling 8%, which is not dramatically different from where the Liberal Democrats were in 2017. 50% of the population believes that we should remain in the EU. Vince Cable leads the only major party that agrees with 50% of the population on the biggest, the most urgent issue we face today. And less than a fifth of those people are willing to vote for him. Now, I would dearly love it. I would dearly love it if I didn't feel compelled to be here today, if I could go back to my life and leave Vince Cable to carry the Remainer banner and to watch him do it successfully. That would be great. But that's not happening. So we've got to try a different approach. That's my position.
James, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think JT said it all there.
Great. Any other questions? At the front, in the jumper.
So, James, in the last election, you stood in Bermondsey and Old Southwark. I'm not quite sure why you choose to stand against Simon Hughes. But anyway, besides that, you got 0.2% of the vote. Mm-hmm. And you're planning to then stand candidates in 650 constituencies at the next election. So if you repeat your success at the last election, that's over £300,000 worth of lost deposits alone, let alone all the other resources and finances you need to run a party, all the campaigns, tens of thousands of pounds perhaps in each constituency, all the staff, offices. Considering there are already, as I mentioned, the Lib Dems, a party that already exists with all that sort of infrastructure in place, surely those resources are a lot better spent elsewhere rather than trying to start from the ground up, because you're not the only new party, centrist party either. So why try and reinvent the wheel, basically, when it's going to cost so much, require so many resources, and you might not get anywhere at all?
Okay, first of all, our own costs are our own business. Second of all, I stood as an independent in Bermondsey and Old Southwark, not as a Renew candidate and with zero machinery behind me. Thirdly, as I think we've made clear, we're not the Lib Dems, and the fact that we're anti-Brexit does not make us the Lib Dems. We're from people from outside politics to renew Britain's hope. So we're doing this on principle, and we're going to stand people, and if we lose deposits, so be it. It needs to be done. If the Lib Dems had done their part, if they weren't, if they'd been slightly better in the coalition, where the Conservatives would never have had the majority that foisted this referendum on us. I don't see these parallels, and I don't see the point of making or asserting that a centrist group from outside politics shouldn't be there because a failed traditional party sits there instead. I reject that totally.
Thank you. Anything else you'd like to add, or shall I move on?
Happy to crack on.
Cool. Next question, please. At the back, yes.
What do you believe in that's not about Brexit? Like, imagine in some fancy world, if you like, you're successful, we stay in the EU, and a sort of en marche movement sweeps you to power. What do you believe in? I was reading your website, and it's got some stuff, but I kind of want to just hear it from you.
I believe in creating a much more equal society by expanding the volume and the range of opportunities that are available to everybody, not just the people who are particularly wealthy, who have particular opportunities in life. I believe in leaving a sustainable world to the next generation, both environmentally and financially. I believe in doing so, what we need to do is we need to build a functioning market economy that is properly regulated in a way that it probably hasn't been over the last 20 years. I believe in properly funding public services in a way that over the last 7 or 8 they haven't been. I believe in taking notice and paying attention to parts of our country that have been marginalized and ignored, taken for granted by many politicians on both the left and the right over the last probably half a century. I believe in doing all of those things because in doing all of those things, you give people power over their own lives and you enable them to be the best version of themselves, which is whatever they choose to be. And that, I think, ultimately, that ability to decide for yourself is what makes people happiest in the world, that sense that you have control over your own life. That's what I want to achieve, and I think we have to have new parties that are going to do things in different ways in order to get there, and that's what I'm looking for.
Thank you. Yes, at the front.
Well, we're faced with two different propositions here. One is a new political party, and the other is a new youth movement. On the first one, youth movement, Ofog, I wish you the best of luck, and I've heard your leader on television. I think if you manage to draw into the debate people who've not been bothered up till now, that's great. But you should certainly talk to the existing youth movements, and in particular, I would say the Young European Movement.
We're working with them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that develops, because we come back to this thing we've been talking about all the time, which is about the Remain side being divided. Mm-hmm. And there are so many different Remain campaigns at the moment. This applies to a new political party as well. I would urge both organisations to get in touch with AC Grayling, who is actually coordinating all these different movements and forcing them to talk to each other, which will help a lot. So coming to the new political party proposal, I've listened to what you've said. That could have been a Liberal speech, by the way, what you just gave. You do have one thing in common with UKIP, though. And I don't know if you're aware of this.
Haircuts?
That is, I haven't actually done a study of that. And that is that part of their appeal to the public was to say they weren't involved in politics, that they weren't politicians. You're forming a political party, you're fighting elections, you are politicians. You mentioned that you draw support from all sorts of different professions.
Yeah,
do
people from
claim
outside politics, it's pretty
clear. But you're not outside politics. You're coming into politics.
We are people from outside politics.
So is every politician. Everybody starts like that. This is what Farage for years said, I'm not a politician. He didn't tell people he'd tried to stand as a Tory candidate 6 times and not been selected. But you can't say this. Once you're involved in politics, you're involved in politics. And it's not that there are 2 species in the country, people involved, politicians, those of us in existing political parties and those who aren't.
It's an accurate way of describing the people that we're recruiting.
Yeah. And an argument could be, I've been a Liberal most of my life. an argument that could be put to me is, why have you wasted your time? Our political system is so constrained that only two parties can survive. That could be said to me, and I've always resisted it. But it is true that if even being a third party, you've got a terrific challenge to make any progress in the system. You're coming up as a fourth, fifth, sixth, whatever you are, party. You're not going to get MPs very quickly. You're not going to change anything very much. I don't understand. The only thing you've said against the Liberals is you didn't like the performance in coalition. Many Liberals didn't like that either. But people didn't understand the weakness of being a minority party in coalition. And the other thing you said was that they're not very popular at the moment. Well, I'll just finish by adding, actually, we now have more members than the Conservative Party. And if you look at the by-elections around the country last night, we did extremely well.
There are a couple of things here. There is a reason why I opened my opening remarks by asking the question, what do we want to achieve? Because we've had quite a few conversations along those lines with Liberals, ex-Liberals, members of the Labour Party, Greens, etc. And they make that argument. And the results are always couched in terms of progress in the system, number of MPs, number of councillors, all of this kind of stuff. What we want is change. If we end up with 50 MPs, that would be, by many conventional political definitions, that would be a cracking result. But if we end up with 50 MPs and 0 influence, that would be a terrible result for us. If we end up with 0 MPs and a lot of influence, that would be an incredible result for us. And you suggest that we've got one thing in common with UKIP. It's worth remembering now, and for those of us, those of you in the room who are Remainers, we need to reconcile ourselves to this. UKIP are winning. If something doesn't change, UKIP, with currently 0 MPs, will have forced upon the British people a monumental change in society, which I believe to be monumentally harmful in society, and that change will be next to irreversible. It's a change that, at best, it will take decades to roll back. Now I don't want to be the UKIP of pro-Europeanism. I want to do something more than that. But if that's the limit to what I can achieve by having people from outside politics, I will take that. And yes, the Liberal Democrats have been successful recently in by-elections in council seats across the country. There have been some really good swings, and that's, in a way, it's heartening. But the national opinion polls aren't shifting, and there are very, very few Tory MPs who are worried about facing a Liberal at the next election. There are very, very few Labour MPs who are worried about facing a Liberal at the next election. And if there are no MPs who are worried about their opposition at the next election, that's terrifying for me. And I don't know if we'll be successful, whether we will be able to worry MPs. I think we can. Walk in and say, if I wasn't here, Kensington would still be Tory. That's the kind of impact that we can have. And it's at the margins, yeah, and you have to get lucky in order to make it work, but it can happen, and that's what we're here for.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add anything? No. Next question at the front, yeah.
Hi, thanks for coming in and talking to us. I'd like to take up the issue of Brexit itself with you, because like you've said, and many people said, that we need the EU to do trade deals all around the world, when actually the EU doesn't have a trade deal with China, it doesn't have a trade deal with the US, it's quite useless for that sort of thing. People say things like, we need the EU to guarantee our workers' rights, and that if British courts can decide for themselves, that suddenly workers are going to have no rights. But where I actually take issue is on the economy. So we're constantly told, or we were at least, that the economy would crash and that it would do terribly, and I admit it hasn't done particularly well. But I think the reason it hasn't done particularly well is because political groups like Renew are existing to try and frustrate the Brexit process. They're stopping people taking the best bits of Brexit. They're stopping people moving forward with this and campaigning for what they want to do within Brexit, and they're then trying to reopen divides. And so I'd really like to ask, why don't you just try and make the most of the opportunities that Brexit can give us? And if you want to campaign for certain things, if you're big on particular issues, then you can campaign for the Brexit you want. But there's no need to re-divide the whole country again. And I think that the action of these kind of groups that are working against the government, which is trying to do the best thing for Brexit that it can, okay, it's taking certain stances on certain issues, but overall it's trying to get the best deal it can. And frustrating the Brexit process in that way is a really negative thing. I think it's time to stop talking down the country in the way that you guys are.
That's interesting. I think when you address the opportunities question, you have to say, what choices do we have to make in order to take advantage of those opportunities? Because it is entirely possible that, yes, there is a world in which the British economy perhaps will grow much faster over the next 100 years. We'll take advantage of trade deals with China and India and Brazil and the fast-growing economies of the world, and we will take advantage of our comparative advantage in services, which are possibly less restricted by geography than trade in goods, and we'll be able to do all of those things. What do you have to do in order to do that? And probably what you have to do is first you have to put in place barriers between us and the European Union. It is not possible to maintain our current links with the European Union and set up new free trading, frictionless, or whatever trading links with the rest of the world. You might well, and this is Patrick Minford,
You say they're new deals, but the EU doesn't have a deal with China. It doesn't have a deal with the US. It just trades on World Trade Organization on rules,
Indeed.
which is what we can do without any deal. So all these kind of new deals, we can make them bespoke, but if they're new, they're only going to be better than what we already have. So it's not like, we have to go out and suddenly make these new deals to work. It's that we can operate as we are and only get better.
Well, it's a nice illusion that you've made, because when you say the EU trades at the moment on WTO deals, that sort of implies that we don't, that we have a somewhat worse deal than we do at the moment, right? No. Yeah, we could go to WTO rules and maintain we could go to WTO rules with the EU and WTO rules with everywhere else. Okay, that dramatically harms our trade with Europe, first of all. And then we can improve our trade with the United States or China or Brazil or wherever by doing deals with them. And all we've done is shifted the focus of our trading preferences from the EU to Brazil and China and the US. That's all we've done. It's not opened up the UK's trading arrangements. We've just shifted focus. And in that change process, in the process of making that choice, we will have destroyed many existing industries. Patrick Minford himself, who is the Brexiteers' favourite economist, says actually what you want to do is you want to, say, set a universal zero tariffs, and that's the best way to generate lots of trade and things like that. And he accepts that what that does is destroy British manufacturing. Now, that might be better for the UK economy as a whole over the next 100 years. I personally doubt it, but the analysis, you can do an analysis which suggests that it would be. But it would be better for certain parts of the UK economy. I'm a Londoner. I have worked in the city. I was a consultant before this. It would probably be quite good for my industry. It would be terrible for this country. It would be terrible in the city that my parents grew up in, Liverpool. It would be terrible in the northeast. It would wipe out huge swathes of the country. And when we come to think about the level of anger that we might create in this country, you want to watch what happens when the rich guys in London come and lay waste to the industries staffed by people who voted for Brexit. When those people find out that the promises from Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson were not worth the hot air that they came in with. And all of that, that is not a price I am willing to pay. I would need huge, I'm just not willing to pay, even if the economic growth that would result from it is massive. It's just not worth it.
Then why shouldn't you campaign for, as you're saying, you want a kind of a deal that we kind of have at the moment, a single market access, things like that. Why don't you campaign for those sort of issues in Brexit?
Because then this is the process that we go through over the next 9 months, and this is how you end up with Remain is the best option. Because you take the hardest possible Brexit and you go, we don't want that. So let's soften it, right? So let's take advantage of single market and customs union access, in which I'm not really sure what benefit that is. That's basically, Brexit is just Theresa May walks out of the room whenever the EU makes a decision, right? That's the only benefit that you get. And that's not a benefit, that's a cost. All you've done is surrender influence. So if you want to retain that influence, well, remember the single market, remember the customs union, you're in the room when you've made the decisions, you're a member of the European Union. The best possible deal, which is, by the way, a bespoke trade deal in the process, the best possible deal that we can get is a deal we've got at the moment, and that's as members of the European Union.
Tommy, you want to
Can I just briefly add something which is really taking issue with the logic of what you said, which is effectively, I know you fundamentally disagree with this, but it's happening anyway, so you may as well go along with it. I mean, that to me seems a completely anti-democratic argument. I mean, it's a bit like going up to a Corbynite and saying, well, a Conservative government's in power, it's happening anyway, so you may as well go and make the best of it. You know, it seems like quite a strange argument, really. The whole point of democracy is that you can disagree with what's happening, as opposed to suspending your judgment on the basis of what's happening. And I think that would be quite a dangerous precedent to set.
Yeah, I think that the assertion that the markets are freaked because Renew emerged, you know, I think you might be exaggerating the influence of Renew a little bit there. I think the markets are freaked because the vote happened, and they're more freaked because of the conduct of the negotiations and the failure to get any good outcomes from that to date. We look at the evidence. The evidence suggests that leaving is worse than remaining. I mean, you don't need to go much further than that. British membership of the EU as a club is something where the benefits outweigh the costs. That's the Brexit argument in a nutshell.
We've got time for one last question, so we'll go to you.
Thank you very much. Charles Rees from Wolfson College. In your initial talks and in the discussions, there's a lot of mention about how awful Brexit is, and even more mention of how awful Brexiters are, complete with a rather attractive racist joke. But nothing about how wonderful the European Union is. And I'd like you perhaps to suggest why an undemocratic supranational government is a good thing. And isn't it the failure to articulate why an undemocratic supranational government called the European Union is such a good thing that was the reason that the referendum was lost in the first instance?
For us, membership of the European Union is a means, it's not an end. I don't join the European Union because I love it, although it has many facets to it that I value very greatly. Can I deny, sorry? Such as I believe that there is a value to me, personally, in viewing myself as part of a broader community than just the UK, in the same way that there is a value to me of being part of a broader community than just somebody who's from London, or just somebody who went to a particular university. And we all have that feeling. We all have lots of different sets of identities that we associate with, and we carry them around with us, and we enjoy them, and it's nice. For me, personally, I enjoy thinking of myself as a European. I enjoy...
for 1,000 years.
Yeah, and...
It's a European language. We're in the European continent. We've been trading with Europe since before the Romans came.
Indeed, and there is a group of Europeans who come together and say, hey, we can feel a little bit more that way if we work together, if we make it easier for us to travel across our borders, if we make it easier for us to move across and live with each other, if we have set up individual programs, whether it's the European Youth Orchestra, or whether it's Erasmus, or whether it's, all sorts of different things that can happen that help us to foster that sense of brotherhood, for want of a better word. And that's something that I value. I don't insist that everybody else has to value it, because I believe that there are concrete benefits that outweigh the costs of being a member of the European Union.
Exactly.
That it might be, I kind of reject the total assertion that it is undemocratic. It clearly has democratic institutions. It clearly has democratic structures that we all have a direct say in the same way that, and you might suggest that the European Commission is undemocratic in the same way that the Cabinet is undemocratic, because I didn't vote directly for it. I didn't elect any members of the Cabinet at the moment. We're willing to tolerate different degrees of representative democracy, and the European Union has democracy. And I'm totally comfortable with that.
Yeah, I lived and worked in Amsterdam for 6 years, and I did that. It was a right which I had. The right to live, work, marry, buy property, retire is a valuable thing, and it's something that's been taken away from our children and perhaps grandchildren. Yes, it is. The right will be removed. We may have the privilege to go back if we're granted it by each of those 27 countries. I didn't need a visa. I didn't need permission to go and live in Amsterdam. I did it. It was a fabulous thing, and I think it's shameful that young people after 2019 may not be allowed to do this. I appreciate that this is a niche issue of the EU, but I think it's one worth stating, and I think it's a powerful one. I think it's something that people should reflect on if they voted leave.
Tommy?
Yeah, and I think from the youth perspective, I think there's a vastly different view of the idea that the European Union is some sort of undemocratic, awful institution at the heart of Europe, and that's kind of reflected in the overwhelmingly Remain vote of the young people. And I think that it is quite a almost ideological argument why lots of young people feel involved with the European Union in ways that maybe some older people don't. And it's, I suppose, that we live in quite an online world. We're connected with these people anyway. It feels quite natural to us that there wouldn't be the same borders that there would be if we left the European Union. Oh, that's true, I'm sure. But as in, we've grown up with that. I think it's kind of inherent to, well, I'm very glad. Obviously, you're a very young person as well, so that makes sense. But and I think, as well as all of the arguments that have been made throughout the referendum campaign, which I suppose it would take too long to recite here, based on clout on the international stage, that we'll lose the ability to actually trade freely with our biggest trading bloc, who's in interests of both sides to do so. I mean, there's so many substantive reasons which I could list off, but I think the most important one is just the general overwhelming democratic desire of young people especially, who are going to be living in this country for, their whole lives, to actually stay in the European Union for very emotive reasons. And I think they've explained that very strongly, and I think they've shown that very strongly. So I think on a point of democracy, as much as anything else, it's important that we listen.
Thank you. And with that, we're going to have to finish. Thank you so much to James and James from Renew and Tommy from OFOC for coming in today and talking about this issue. It's been very interesting to have panelists who are on the side of stopping Brexit and being able to listen to challenges and questions from people who maybe disagree or think there's another way about it. I think it was a very interesting discussion to be had, so thank you very much for taking part. And if you want to find out any more about either of these two groups, you can look them up online. Otherwise, at the Union tomorrow, we have former SAS officer Jason Fox at lunchtime, who's talking about how he went undercover with Pablo Escobar in Colombia, which is pretty cool. It's, a bit different. And we also have Ukrainian MP Sergei Leshchenko on Sunday, and our debate next week is on Israel, and should be very interesting. Thank you very much for coming. If we can give one final thanks to our speakers. Thank you.